Hey, Dr. C here with you. Got a really good question sent in. I'm going to read this to you. Hi, Dr. C. I lost 18 pounds on the Metabolism Reset Diet, but my sister won't try it. She said I should not eat carbohydrates because Americans only started gaining weight after they went low fat and high carbohydrate. Is this true? Awesome question. This comes up. This is a fair question, and this is a common thing that many people do talk about. The typical scenario that you hear discussed is that America went low fat in the 80s, and that was the real cause of the obesity crisis. And I just want to throw out my bias in this and my perspective on things just to make that part clear. I'm not the carb guy. I'm not the guy who says carbs are magical. And I'm not the guy that says fats are bad, quite the opposite. The funny thing was that in the early 90s, I was writing for a food cooperative in northern Minnesota. Well, I was the clerk as well, and I also stocked the shelves and dusted and did whatever, and I'd write for their little printed newsletter back when. And I was writing about, food and supplements and these interests. And this was the height of the low-fat movement. And I don't know, I don't think I'm just inherently contrarian, but I was against the severe versions of the low-fat movement. So there were some government recommendations, which we'll come to. They were pretty moderated, actually. They weren't very extreme. They suggested keeping fat to 30% of calories or just below that. But many people took that message and thought, if some reduction is better, then more must be even better yet. And many encouraged going full-on fat-free. And there was a lot of books about that. And I remember at one point, I was also working at a nursing home as a nurse's aide, and a coworker talked about how she loved the new low-fat thing because jelly beans and pretzels were now health foods, and she loved them. And I thought somehow that just can't be right. Jelly beans and pretzels just can't be health foods. That just didn't fit in my head about what would really serve us. So I talked then about how protein was important. I've talked about that for a long time, and I talked about how fat was not a bad thing. You actually needed some fat in a healthy diet. That there was a lot of data about fish fats, Mediterranean fats being useful and not being bad. And we now know that, macronutrients, the fats, proteins, carbs, they are nutrients. And macro, we need quantities of them. They're all things that we need in a healthy diet. So I don't have a bias towards fats being good or bad, carbs being good or bad. I think they all have their place. So let's talk through about this idea. The first question is, did we really go low fat? Was that where the obesity crisis came from? I should back up. The obesity crisis really did seem to emerge in the early 80s, and it really picked up steam in the early to mid 90s, and it became just almost this inflection point by the 2000s. So yes, it did change around then. And during that time, there were government guidelines that suggested lowering fat to about 30% of energy. And the average American did lower their percent fat by a little bit. Those things are true. Now, let's get into the details a little bit more. I'm going to share some images with you because these are illustrative. And these are images that Stephen Guyenet pulled together from some public available data that are highly informative. I'm a fan of his work, and if you've not been exposed to it, he's a really good resource on many things. So here's our intake on macronutrients, fats, carbs, proteins, going back from 1909 all the way to 2006. Now, if you look at our fat intake, well, over the whole arc, maybe it went up a bit, but it didn't drop off. So I said earlier that our percent calories by fat went down, but how could that happen in the 80s if our fat intake didn't go down? Well, our percent fat went from about 37% on average to about 34% on average. So many people did go extremely low fat, but they were quite the exception. The average person didn't change much at all, and they didn't even hit the recommended target of less than 30% that the government put out. So how could that be that the percent went down if the amount didn't change? Well, what did happen in the 80s is that people consumed more total food, and carbohydrate intake went up. Now, when you look even more deeply on this data, it wasn't that people were eating more brown rice or eating more whole grain bread or whole grain pasta or beans or potatoes. No, people ate the same amount of those foods they always ate, but what they did do was they ate more processed sugar-sweetened grain products. So this would be the epitome of this would be like the Snackwell cookies that were, fat-free, but tons of sugar and processed ingredients. So people got the message about fat being bad, and they didn't cut fat out at all. The fat intake stayed exactly the same. But what they heard was, oh, carbs of all types are great and fine, of all types, even processed. And so they heard that part of the message, because I think that's the part that a lot of us wanted to hear. And so they ended up raising their intake of highly processed carbohydrates and sugars. It wasn't that good natural carbs went up, but processed carbs did go up. And that was a factor causing weight gain. No debate about that. But again, it wasn't because they lowered fat and raised carbohydrate. They didn't lower fat. So the percentage of fat went down only because the total food went up. So if you raise the total amount of food but don't change the fat, well, the percent of fat will go down because there's less percent fat. But the amount never went down, so it actually didn't occur. So that was like the extreme fundamentalist almost message from the low-fat group is the message that got heard, that fats were bad, but carbs of all types were safe, and carbs of all types were good. So that's what people started doing, is they just added in more processed carbohydrate. But then afterward, starting in about 2000, the low-carb message started to take hold. People were hearing the idea about low-carb being the way to go. So let's move forward a bit and see how things played out from that message. Well, in about 2000, the intake of carbohydrate in terms of absolute amount did start to drop off. And people lowered their carb intake by significant amounts in those years. But this obesity trend, which was rising, it didn't budge. It didn't really change. The rates kept on going up. The drop in carbs didn't change that. So what happened when people started lowering their carb intake? They were eating then more fat. They just raised their fat. They figured, oh, if fats are okay, I can add fat on top of my diet. So this time, they did lower the absolute amount of carbohydrate, whereas before they didn't lower the amount of fat. This time they did lower that food group, but they more than compensated with a different food group. And it's even weirder than that. So sugar intake also went down. People ate less processed sugar starting in the year 2000. They did hear that low-carb message, and they went down by a substantial amount in their sugar intake. But that also didn't change the arc of the obesity crisis at all. It kept on going the same way it was, even though they were eating less sugar. It didn't even budge it. So the point of this is that the ratio of fats, carbs, it's not a significant variable. It's really how much you're eating does matter. Your protein matters, how much satiety you're getting matters, your sleep, your stress load matters, the consistency of your daily habits, your rhythms, your wake times, those things all make a difference. But playing around fats and carbs, if you're just rearranging them, that will not help, and it did not help. So to answer the question, you are safe to eat carbohydrate, and no, carbohydrate was not the cause of the obesity crisis. If it were, people would have gotten better when they lowered carbohydrate. And we saw historically that they never went. Before, they didn't go low fat. Low fat wasn't the culprit because it didn't even happen. No one dropped their fat intake. So hope those images were useful. And again, thanks to Dr. Stephen Guillenet for putting that data together for us, and just wanted to share that perspective. Dr. C with you. Take great care, and I'll see you again real soon. Bye-bye.